On today's World Insight, top diplomacy among key Chinese and European Union leaders as Beijing rolls out the red carpet for the 25th China-EU summit. How are relations between China and the EU shaping up amid complex challenges in world trade, global warming, and security? What's on the agenda?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing. Chinese President Xi Jinping has met with European Council President Antonio Costa and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in Beijing. Chinese President called on the EU to work with China in shoring up global stability and certainty through steady, sound relations.
今年是中欧建交50周年。
This year marks the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations between China and the EU. Over the past 5 decades, our exchanges and cooperation have yielded fruitful outcomes. The key lesson we have learned is the importance of mutual respect, seeking common ground while shelving differences, and pursuing open, mutually beneficial cooperation.
That's Chinese President Xi Jinping in the meeting with his European counterparts. After the meeting, Chinese Premier Li Qiang co-chaired the 25th China-EU summit with the two European leaders. Premier Li from China did stress both sides should strengthen cooperation while safeguarding multilateralism and free trade. He pushed for international equity and justice under a multipolar world order. A joint statement on climate change was issued after the summit.
We want to work together on global peace and security, prosperity and sustainable development. As such, tackling the global challenge of climate change is shared priority.
The top-level contacts come at a critical moment. So how can both sides work together toward a mutually beneficial relationship for the peoples in China, Europe, and beyond? Let's talk to our panelists. Joining us, the panelists in Paris, Joab Toker from American Graduate School. In Brussels, Peter Klepp, Editor-in-Chief of BrusselsReport.eu. In Beijing, Liu Baocheng from University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Now, long anticipated China-EU summit, and certainly the meetings between Chinese president and the two European leaders. On top of people's mind is this agreement, or shall we say statement, on green development and cooperation. Here I would like to take a look together with our audience at some of the specific content, if we could play that graphic. Green transition is a common goal for China, said the statement, and the EU. The joint statement on climate change issued after the meeting suggests that both sides can enhance bilateral cooperation in such areas as energy transition, adaptation, methane emissions management and control, carbon markets, green and low carbon technologies bode well for their respective green and low carbon transition goals. And there are several other areas of cooperation between the two sides as well. As we can see, gentlemen, it is already very concrete when it comes to this statement, particularly its emphasis on the Paris Agreement and UNFCCC, and also the efforts that both sides should make toward COP30. Now, Mr. Klepp, well, in Brussels, looking at the latest statement on green development and cooperation, what goes to your mind? What can this step mean for building better bilateral trust between China and the EU?
Well, this summit was apparently supposed to be 2 days. It was cut down by one, which is an indication of sort of the challenges in the relationship between the EU and China, at least politically, because trade continues.
Let's talk about the green first.
Nicely.
Then we are going to other areas. So let's be specific now. Green.
Sure.
Please, Mr. Klepp.
So I think there we see largely, aspirational statement without too many concrete commitments. And this also reflects that back in the European Union, support for a certain kind of climate policy with lots of central planning, taxation, strict regulation. That kind of climate policy model is clearly under fire. Already last year, during the European Parliament elections, we could see the Green parties across Europe suffering heavy losses. And now in Brussels, there's strong political pressure to wind down some of the excesses in climate policy. So
But
I
you
think
saw the
Ms. von der
statement, right?
Leyen
There are
is,
7
yeah.
clauses in that statement. Of course, the interpretation of it still needs to be further discussed. It is a statement rather than a specific regulations or like trade contracts. But if you look at the statement, especially clause 7, which I just read to everyone, there are very specific issues that both sides illustrated. So let's put on the cliche discussions aside. Let's just specifically look at these areas. What are these areas can mean for all of us in terms of building trust between the two sides, particularly leading up to COP30? Mr. Clapp, once again, if you can.
Well, I think China is important when it comes to imports of solar panels. Even the production of many of these windmills is happening in China. So, you know, a lot of the renewable energy economy is happening privately. So I would expect that if you're looking for increased trade between China and the EU, we'll definitely see more trade there, to the extent that consumers, of course, continue to buy these solar panels and windmills. Now, I would be more optimistic about the solar economy than the wind industry. That's clearly in trouble in Europe at the moment. Across Europe, projects are being wound down. But indeed, China is a very important producer there. So if you're looking at some practical relevance, yeah, perhaps you can find something there.
Mr. Clapp, I do find something here if looking at the statement very clearly. Mr. Tokers, though, let me go to you. We have seen the very first statement since 2019 between the two sides, China and EU. This is quite a statement in terms of its timing. But at the same time, it said very briefly about the commitment by both sides, UNFCCC and Paris Agreement. Now, that is with the backdrop of some economies already withdraw from the Paris Agreement and also their commitment on climate change. Well, at the same time, both sides have been talking about looking for ambitious, balanced, equitable, and inclusive outcome with the COP30. Now, to you, Professor Toker, what does that say?
It says what final communiques of summits are supposed to say. Excuse me for putting it this way, namely trying to highlight the elements which went relatively well, rather than other elements which did not go so well or which we still don't know very well how they went. The Europeans and the Chinese for a long time have had sort of common language and relatively tight cooperation and good relations when it comes to climate change and some other ecologically minded issues. This has proven to be the case also today in Beijing in this summit.
I see.
However, I cannot ignore what was actually transparent in my colleagues in Brussels, so to speak, aspirational wording. Namely, there is an expression of things that both the European and the Chinese would like to see, including the side towards the Brazilian climate change summit, which is coming up.
Yeah, COP30, that is.
An elephant in the room. There is at least one elephant in the room, if not several elephants in the room. And the major elephant in the room is called USA, because we know that the changing, sometimes provocative positions of President Trump, when it comes to climate change, but more urgently even right now when it comes to trade issues and tariff negotiations, are on the center of the minds of the Europeans and the Chinese and so many other global partners. And there is no reference to that at all in the communique.
Well, that statement is on the green issue, not necessarily on the trade. We haven't seen any statement on the trade, but we hope there will be more outcomes made public later in the week. But having said that, though, Mr. Liu, in the statement also suggesting about COP30, as we know, both sides, China and the EU, need to provide publicly before COP30 the commitment in terms of what they call the national commitment. That is one of the most important documents economies are supposed to provide before COP30. Now, that shows how much commitment is being made, how those commitments will be done, and it is also very specific and can be checked later. So, Professor Liu, if you look at that statement made by both sides, China and EU today, certainly make clear that both sides will provide the national commitment to the COP30. What does that say to you, particularly with the current speed and transition that you see both here in China and in the EU economies?
Well, among a number of challenging issues, at least both China and the EU see eye to eye with regard to the climate change and also their role in addressing this common issue that facing the world. And now we have a number of fruitful, successful working projects that has been going on, and in terms of technology, in terms of the joint research, in terms of the even consumer education. So I think now this statement is also another milestone to reinstate the importance of it and to reinstate the consensus both sides have reached. And now, as you mentioned, that there are specific statements as when and how to submit the NDC, the determined contribution,
right,
voluntarily by each side before the COP30. And now both sides also see that they have large room to work together by identifying some of the differences in different development level and also in the industrial structure. So therefore, with the timetable, but we are working in the same direction. And I think what can be expected is better transparency, and hopefully there can be also a sort of supervisional body that can be jointly developed to ensure that those roadmaps and milestones can be achieved along the way.
We'll see whether those mechanisms will be established as it goes along the time. Having said that, though, all of you have suggested there's one issue that is crucial. Of course, it's the trade economic ties between China and the EU. Earlier, we have seen both sides were dealing with some difficulties, to say the least, showing so-called hardballs before the summit. But if you look at what is being said, the EU side has been suggesting about a word so-called balance. Well, the Chinese side has been, according to the Chinese president here, I read, quote, reducing dependency should not lead to reducing China-EU cooperation. This bilateral economic and trade relationship, which is by nature complementary and mutually beneficial, can indeed achieve dynamic equilibrium through development, end quote. To you, Professor Liu, this seems to suggest that it is a moving, or shall I say, balance that we are looking at from China's perspective in terms of trade.
Yeah, there has been large potential that we've been working together, and the fact that we have so many EU companies who are firmly footed in China and highly welcomed and getting so popular among the Chinese people. And on the other hand, more of the Chinese people, Chinese companies are investing in the green technologies within the EU in terms of the car parts and the storage capacities for the new energy, and now there are also many of the construction projects dealing with infrastructures in EU. So there's a good reason that we need to step up such sort of cooperation, despite of some of the differences on historical past and on the different development paths, ahead. So therefore, I think President Xi really points out that we need to really contain those differences and find the commonalities and discover the dynamism to calibrate the collaboration structure. It's not only in terms of the business with regard to investment and trade, but also there are many other ways in terms of technological cooperation and joint research, joint education. And so there are so much so that we need to resume some of the very constructive dialogue mechanism and move forward hand in hand.
Professor Toker, how would you interpret dynamic equilibrium as said by the Chinese side? Also, when it comes to so-called balanced, we understand there are very different opinions within the EU economies themselves. So what is a balanced, quote-unquote, view coming from Brussels?
That's an excellent question, which addresses itself to this term of balance, which is not a balance, which is actually a dynamic one. And what do we put into the characteristics of a dynamic equilibrium? Does it mean that there is no balance, or does it mean that lack of balance could still be considered as a positive, acceptable idea on both sides? I'm just reminding everybody that the deficit in favor of China in the EU-Chinese mutual trade relationship has doubled over the last 10 years.
In goods, but when it comes to services, it's a much more complex picture.
That's
and
correct.
trade made of
correct.
two components. One is in goods, the other is service. It has to be added together when it's called trade.
Absolutely. This is, by the way, also a very important element on the current rough negotiations between the Europeans and the Americans on this issue. But that's extremely pertinent into what we should try and understand in this balanced equilibrium.
Right.
Usually what happens in this kind of summits, especially those summits such as this one, which are born with some difficulties, as we know, there were actually the plans, I think the original plans was for President Xi to come over to Brussels. Eventually it takes place in Beijing rather than in Europe. It's clear that there are hesitations and difficulties because the global agenda is loaded with elements which are worrisome.
Yeah.
But usually right after the communique comes details, comes elements which are not part of the official wording and which may shed some light into specific, including this potential element of looking at balances and trade balances in a way which would be less traditional than just adding up figures on two columns and seeing whether they are equal or not.
We noticed that both sides are using very different words, though we cannot say specifically at this moment what would these words lead to. We could play with the political games of words, but eventually solutions both sides has been suggesting. That is very interesting to me. Mr. Klepp, how would you interpret when the Chinese side suggests a dynamic equilibrium, while the EU side suggested the balanced? How can we make sure that the two concepts, if we can, could actually eventually meet one another? That is the most important thing.
Well, the truth is that these concepts are very much up for interpretation.
Indeed.
And fundamentally, the whole idea of balance in trade doesn't make much sense. A trade deficit can be good or bad, depending on whether it's financed by excessive debt or not. And as you rightly point out, you have to look not only at goods trade but also at services trade. But of course, at the heart of the matter is the concern in Europe that China is insufficiently open to European business. And that sort of goes beyond the whole balance discussion. Now, this is not a new concern, but what is new is that because of the trade war that was started by American President Trump, that there is a fear in Europe that many of the Chinese goods that were supposed to go to the United States will now go to the EU, and that this will drive down prices and erode the profit margins of European companies. So that is at the moment the most pressing concern. But of course, that also depends on the deal between the EU and Trump, and the deal between China and Trump. So things are moving. So it's actually quite difficult to sort it out before we know where we will land.
That's why it's so interesting, isn't
Trump.
it, Mr. Clapp? As you know very well, based in Brussels, there
Yes.
are a lot of moving factors. Right before the China-EU summit, we have heard a lot of things coming out of Washington suggest this has been done, that has been done, this is suggested as an agreement, even though we haven't heard much clear statements from the so-called trading partners that Washington suggested they had agreement with. Having said that, though, this is a very, shall we say, using Chinese leaders' words, a dynamic equilibrium that we are talking about. And meanwhile, we have seen Professor Liu trade not only in goods and services, but these days technologies is so much related to trade. Now, today, Washington put out its AI Act, in which there are certain content going to impact including Washington's allies tremendously, not necessarily very positively though. So all of these are moving factors. I'm sure Brussels and Beijing are looking very closely. And coming up on Monday and Tuesday, we are going to see Chinese Vice Premier meeting his American counterparts as well. So we are seeing a lot of things all at the same time, checking on one another, all these different events. Professor Liu.
I think technology commands market value. In order to continue the innovation process, technology needs to be received by market, and so China is one of the biggest markets that those innovations can look at, both in terms of technology per se and also the related equipments. And now, by containing such sort of sales into such a big, promising market is really suicidal in many ways. And I used to work in an American research company, although I was leading on the business side. And we were eager to translate our cutting-edge technology into equity positions in the joint venture companies within China. So this is the and plus that technology per se, it has shelf life. So therefore, if you really keep it in the pocket for long, and then it's going to lose its value, very rapidly. And the other issue is that how those technologies can really benefit the consumers, and they will give back the right type of vote in terms of their payment capacity. So now when the distrust is going on, it seems that everything can be related with national security, from technology as how to make boosts and how to make chips,
We have
etc.
noticed some very interesting things coming out of capitals. For example, today with the AI Act in Washington is talking about the US dominance. And yet in France, for example, Professor Toker, we are also seeing French leaders suggesting, as one of the strong economies in Europe, more European independence when it comes to technology as well. All of these things are going on. But at the same time, Professor Liu, we noticed that the Chinese president, during his meeting with the European counterparts, also talked about Europe should remain open in trade and investment market, refrain from using restrictive economic and trade tools, foster sound business environment for Chinese enterprises investing and operating in the EU. It seems that both sides at least have one common ground. They want the markets open for each other. So isn't that something that the two sides can work on together at least?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Professor Liu and Professor Toker.
There has always been a shifting between the efficiency versus the security considerations in international trade. But I think she mentioned that to promote efficiency by mutual exchange and by strengthening cooperation is the way forward. actually to beef up the national security. So it is really a positive feedback loop. And now, now when security, particularly on the digital technology, etc., is playing a dominating consideration, and that really deters the level of efficiency and even the level of innovation in terms of cooperation.
Well, very philosophical, Professor. I have to say your answer is, Professor Toker, I hope less philosophical, please.
Well, I guess all the three partners here, the Europeans, the Chinese, and the Americans, would like very much to being able to refer to global markets in these terms of openness, but we're so far away from it. Let's be more realistic. And one more thing I'd like to add before we were off the air, which is that maybe more than in any other time in recent years, the trade and cooperation and dynamic balances, equilibriums, issues are related these days to purely geopolitical elements. And on top of them, at least through the point of view of the West and the Europeans, the war in Ukraine. Now, it is not mentioned at all in the communiques, although the communiques, of course, are that's
There's no
in view of the
communique.
climate
We are
change.
talking about a green statement
right.
earlier. There's one statement. The statement is on green and climate change. It's not a communique,
Yes, but
by
in
the
order
way.
to understand everything, including what you so importantly
Which you just
mentioned,
said lead me to another question. We have less than 2 minutes to wrap it up. So let me ask, because it's very important, that is both sides still commit strategically on a long-term relationship, particularly at this critical juncture. That at least should be touched on in our discussion. Mr. Clapp, 1 minute if you can, and then I go to Professor Liu for both sides at 1 minute. Okay, Mr. Clapp, strategically.
Well, to comment on that, yeah, I think there's understanding on both sides that decoupling is a bad idea. That ultimately China and its important economic weight is there to stay. So we need to find a way forward together.
Professor Liu, strategically, you have heard from both sides in their opening statement about how important this relationship is. 50 years, after all, this is.
Yeah, so 50 years ago, actually, many of the European companies, they broke the ice, after the Cold War period. So I think now both sides need really to show a continuous vision to be able to work together. And now that we have a far better condition to share not only the market, but also the technology, and also share the commitment and responsibility towards the climate change, which is the shared future for the humankind.
Three largest economies in the world, China, US, and EU. Now we have got the two, at least talking to one another, China and the EU. We're looking forward to what's coming up next on Monday and Tuesday between China and the US. Joab Toker, Peter Clapp, Liu Baozheng, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.